Carmen sat by the small, dimly lit window of their modest apartment, watching the rain trickle down the glass. The rhythmic patter was a sad melody that mirrored her feelings. Daniel, her 3-year-old son, played quietly with his worn-out toy car, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing inside his mother's heart. 3 years ago, Ricardo had left Carmen for a younger woman, abandoning her and their newborn son. The betrayal had been a sharp knife to her heart, but she had no time to mourn. Her love for Daniel fueled her strength, and she threw herself into the role of a single mother with unwavering dedication. "Mommy, look!" Daniel's voice broke her reverie. He held up his toy car, a bright smile lighting up his innocent face. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Carmen replied, forcing a smile. Her heart ached seeing the joy in his eyes, knowing she could barely afford to keep a roof over their heads. The town they lived in was small, with limited opportunities. Carmen worked 2 jobs, cleaning houses during the day and waitressing at a diner by night. Despite her efforts, money was always tight. The eviction notice she had received that morning weighed heavily on her mind. If she didn't come up with the rent soon, they would be out on the streets. Determined to do everything she could for Daniel, Carmen decided to confront Ricardo. She needed his help, even though she dreaded the encounter. She found him at his new apartment, living comfortably with his new partner. "Ricardo, we need to talk," she began, trying to keep her voice steady. He looked at her with a mix of annoyance and indifference. "What do you want, Carmen?" "We need child support. Daniel is your son too," she pleaded. Ricardo sighed, shaking his head. "I have a new life now. Talk to my lawyer if you want money." The coldness in his voice crushed her. How could he be so indifferent to their child's well-being? With a heavy heart, she left, knowing she was on her own. As she walked back home, the weight of her situation pressed down on her. The eviction notice seemed to mock her from her purse. She couldn't let Daniel suffer because of Ricardo's abandonment. Later that night, as she tucked Daniel into bed, he looked up at her with his big, trusting eyes. "Mommy, will we always be together?" Carmen swallowed the lump in her throat and kissed his forehead. "Always, my love. I promise." She sat by his bedside, watching him fall asleep, her heart filled with both love and determination. She had to find a way to keep them together, no matter what. The next day, Carmen spent her lunch break making calls and searching for any possible solution. She reached out to charities, looked into government assistance, and even considered selling the few valuables she had left. But every option seemed to fall short. That evening, as she served coffee at the diner, her mind raced with worries. The regular customers noticed her distracted state. Mrs. Harper, an elderly woman who frequented the diner, gently touched Carmen's hand as she refilled her cup. "Everything all right, dear?" Mrs. Harper asked, her eyes filled with concern. Carmen forced a smile. "Just a bit tired, that's all." Mrs. Harper patted her hand reassuringly. "You're a strong woman, Carmen. Don't forget that." When her shift ended, Carmen walked home through the quiet streets, the weight of the eviction notice still heavy in her pocket. She looked up at the night sky, stars barely visible through the city lights, and made a silent vow to herself and to Daniel. "We will get through this," she whispered, her voice firm despite the tears that threatened to spill. "No matter what it takes, we will get through this." As she entered their apartment, she paused for a moment, taking in the small, familiar space. It wasn't much, but it was home, and she would do everything in her power to keep it that way. Carmen fell asleep that night with a renewed sense of determination. The road ahead was uncertain, but she knew one thing for sure. She would never give up on Daniel. He was her light, her hope, and the reason she fought so hard every single day. The morning sun peeked through the thin curtains of their modest apartment, casting a warm glow over the small living room. Carmen stood at the kitchen counter preparing breakfast. She glanced at Daniel, who was busy dribbling a small soccer ball across the worn carpet, his eyes shining with excitement. "Mum, guess what?" Daniel's voice was filled with enthusiasm as he kicked the ball toward her. "Carlos told me about this local football club. They practice every day after school. Can I join, please?" Carmen paused, her heart aching at the thought of disappointing her son. Money was tight, and she knew that enrolling him in the club would be an additional financial burden. But the joy in Daniel's eyes gave her strength. "That sounds amazing, Daniel," she said, smiling as she handed him a plate of scrambled eggs. "Let me see what I can do, okay?" Daniel's face lit up with hope. "Thanks, Mum. I promise I'll be the best player ever." As he devoured his breakfast, Carmen's mind raced with possibilities. She had already stretched their budget to the limit, but she couldn't bear to see Daniel's dreams crushed. After breakfast, she sat down at the small kitchen table, her gaze drifting to the jewelry box on the shelf. Inside was her late mother's necklace, a cherished heirloom that held countless memories. Taking a deep breath, Carmen made up her mind. She carefully took the necklace from its box, feeling the weight of her decision. It was a precious piece of her past, but Daniel's future was worth more. She knew what she had to do. That afternoon, Carmen visited a local pawn shop. The bell above the door jingled as she entered, and the shopkeeper looked up with a curious expression. "Good afternoon," he greeted her. "How can I help you today?" Carmen held up the necklace, her fingers trembling slightly. "I'd like to sell this," she said. The shopkeeper examined the necklace, nodding appreciatively. "This is a beautiful piece. I'll give you a fair price for it." As he counted out the money, Carmen felt a mix of sadness and resolve. She was letting go of a piece of her past to secure Daniel's future. It was a sacrifice she was willing to make. With the money in hand, Carmen headed straight to the local football club. The sound of children laughing and playing filled the air, and she felt a glimmer of hope. She approached the registration desk, where a friendly-looking coach greeted her. "Hello, how can I assist you?" the coach asked. "I'm here to enroll my son Daniel in the football club," Carmen replied, her heart pounding with anticipation. The coach smiled warmly. "Great. We're always excited to welcome new players. Just fill out these forms, and we'll get him started." Carmen filled out the forms with meticulous care, feeling a sense of accomplishment as she handed them back. She had done it. Daniel's dream was within reach. That evening, she picked Daniel up from school, unable to contain her excitement. "Daniel, guess what?" she said, her eyes sparkling with joy. "What, Mom?" Daniel asked, his curiosity piqued. "You're officially enrolled in the football club," she announced. Daniel's face lit up with pure happiness. He threw his arms around her, hugging her tightly. "Thank you, Mum. This is the best news ever." As they walked home, Daniel chattered excitedly about his future in football. Carmen listened with a full heart, grateful for the moment of hope and joy. Over the next few weeks, Daniel threw himself into football with relentless passion. Carmen watched with pride as he practiced every day, his skills improving rapidly. He made new friends, including Martin, whose mother, Mrs. Mendoza, often stayed to watch the practices. One day, as Carmen chatted with Mrs. Mendoza, she felt a renewed sense of community and support. "Daniel is doing so well," Mrs. Mendoza remarked, smiling warmly. "You must be very proud." "I am," Carmen replied, her voice filled with emotion. He's worked so hard, and it's all he talks about." Mrs. Mendoza nodded, her eyes kind. "It takes a strong and loving parent to support their child's dreams like you do, Carmen." As the weeks turned into months, Daniel continued to thrive in the football club. Carmen's sacrifices had not been in vain. Each time she saw her son on the field, his face glowing with happiness and determination, she knew that every challenge, every hardship was worth it. The crisp autumn air filled the football field as children practiced, their laughter echoing across the grounds. Daniel, with his bright smile and boundless energy, stood out among them. Carmen watched from the sidelines, her heart swelling with pride as he deftly maneuvered the ball, scoring goal after goal. "Mum, did you see that?" Daniel ran over, his face flushed with excitement. "I did, sweetheart. You were amazing," Carmen replied, hugging him tightly. Yet, beneath her joy, a worry gnawed at her. The championship was approaching, and Daniel needed a proper uniform. The worn-out clothes he currently wore wouldn't suffice. That evening, as they walked home, Daniel chatted excitedly about the upcoming match. "Mom, Coach says if we win the championship, scouts from the national team might notice us." Carmen smiled, but her mind was elsewhere. How could she afford the uniform? Her recent expenses had already stretched their budget thin. She couldn't bear to dampen Daniel's excitement with her concerns. The next day, Carmen arrived at the field early, hoping to talk to the coach about possible alternatives. As she waited, Mrs. Mendoza, Martine's mother, approached her. "Hello, Carmen. How are you?" Mrs. Mendoza greeted warmly. "I'm well, thank you. Just a bit worried about the upcoming championship," Carmen admitted. Mrs. Mendoza gave her a knowing look. "Is it about the uniform?" Carmen nodded, feeling a lump in her throat. "Yes. Daniel's so excited, but I don't know how I'll afford it." Mrs. Mendoza placed a comforting hand on Carmen's arm. "Carmen, you're a wonderful mother. Daniel's lucky to have you. Let me help." Before Carmen could protest, Mrs. Mendoza continued, "I insist. Consider it a gift for Daniel's hard work and dedication." The following week, Mrs. Mendoza handed Daniel a beautifully wrapped package after practice. "Daniel, this is for you," she said, smiling warmly. Daniel's eyes widened in surprise. "What is it?" "Open it and see," Mrs. Mendoza urged. With trembling hands, Daniel unwrapped the package to reveal a brand new football uniform. His eyes sparkled with joy. "Thank you so much. This is amazing." Carmen, watching nearby, felt tears of gratitude well up in her eyes. She approached Mrs. Mendoza, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank you. You have no idea how much this means to us." Mrs. Mendoza simply smiled. "Seeing Daniel happy is thanks enough." With renewed confidence, Daniel's team went on to win a local match that weekend. The victory bolstered their spirits and brought them one step closer to the championship. As Daniel celebrated with his teammates, Carmen stood by, her heart filled with hope and gratitude. "Mom, we did it! We're going to the championship!" Daniel exclaimed, running to her with his new uniform shining in the afternoon sun. "You were incredible, Daniel," Carmen said, hugging him tightly. "I'm so proud of you." Daniel's joy was infectious. Carmen felt a glimmer of hope for the future. The challenges they faced were daunting, but with the support of kind-hearted people like Mrs. Mendoza, they could overcome anything. In the quiet of their apartment, Carmen tucked Daniel into bed, her heart lightened by the day's events. She kissed his forehead and whispered, "Always believe in your dreams, Daniel. Together, we can achieve anything." As Daniel drifted off to sleep, Carmen sat by his bedside, a sense of peace washing over her. The road ahead might still be difficult, but with the love and support surrounding them, she knew they would find a way through. The crisp morning air was filled with excitement and anticipation. The capital city awaited, a place of dreams and possibilities. Carmen stood at the edge of the field, her heart swelling with pride as she watched Daniel lead the team with unwavering determination. "Mom, can you believe it? We're really going to the championship?" Daniel's eyes sparkled with excitement as he jogged over during a break. "I can believe it, sweetheart. You've worked so hard for this," Carmen replied, her smile radiant, but her mind clouded with worry. The trip to the capital would be expensive, and she had already stretched their finances thin. As practice ended, Carmen approached the coach to confirm the details of the trip. "Coach, do you have a final cost estimate for the trip?" The coach nodded, handing her a printed sheet. "This should cover transportation, lodging, and meals for the team. We're trying to keep it as affordable as possible." Carmen scanned the paper, her heart sinking as she calculated the total. It was more than she had anticipated. She thanked the coach and walked home with Daniel, her mind racing with possible solutions. That evening, after Daniel had gone to bed, Carmen sat at the kitchen table, staring at her latest paycheck. It wasn't enough. She took a deep breath and made a decision. She would spend her entire salary on the trip, ensuring Daniel had the chance to compete. But it still wasn't enough. She needed more. The next day at work, Carmen approached her boss, Mr. Thompson, with a determined look. "Mr. Thompson, I'd like to request some extra hours, if possible. I need to save up for an important trip for my son." Mr. Thompson looked up from his paperwork, his expression thoughtful. "Carmen, you're one of our best employees. I know things have been tough for you. We could use some help on the weekend shifts. Would that work for you?" Carmen's heart leapt with gratitude. "Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Mr. Thompson." As she left his office, a sense of relief washed over her. The extra hours would provide the temporary financial relief she needed. She could make this work. That evening, she shared the news with Daniel. "Mom, you're the best. I can't wait to play in the capital," Daniel said, hugging her tightly. Carmen held him close, her voice filled with emotion. "I'm so proud of you, Daniel. You deserve this opportunity, and I'll do everything I can to support you." In the days leading up to the trip, Carmen worked tirelessly, taking on the extra hours and ensuring every detail was planned. The community also rallied around them. Mrs. Mendoza helped with organizing a small fundraiser at the local market, where neighbors donated what they could. On the morning of their departure, the team gathered at the local bus station. Parents and friends waved goodbye, their faces full of hope and pride. Carmen stood with Daniel, her heart pounding with a mix of excitement and anxiety. "Ready for this, champ?" she asked, ruffling his hair. "Ready as ever, Mom," Daniel replied, his confidence infectious. As the bus pulled away, Carmen watched the familiar town fade into the distance. The capital city, with its towering buildings and bustling streets, represented more than just a destination. It was a place where dreams could come true. Arriving in the capital, the team settled into their accommodations. The city was overwhelming, with its endless noise and activity, but Daniel's excitement never wavered. They spent the evening exploring, Carmen pointing out landmarks from her own childhood memories of the city. The next day, the championship began. The stadium buzzed with energy as teams from across the country gathered to compete. Carmen sat in the stands, her heart in her throat as Daniel took the field. She cheered with all her might, her pride in her son outshining every worry. The match was intense, each goal met with roars of excitement. Daniel played with a fierce determination, his new uniform a symbol of hope and possibility. The stadium erupted in cheers as the final whistle blew. Daniel's team had won the championship, and the victory felt surreal. Carmen rushed onto the field, her heart pounding with pride and joy. She embraced Daniel, tears streaming down her face. "You did it, Daniel. You really did it," she exclaimed, her voice trembling with emotion. Daniel grinned, his eyes sparkling with excitement. "We did it, Mom. I couldn't have done it without you." As they celebrated, a man in a sharp suit approached them. He introduced himself as Mr. Rodriguez, a talent scout for the national team. "Daniel, your performance was outstanding. We'd like to offer you a place on the national youth team." Daniel's eyes widened in disbelief. "Really? I can't believe it." Carmen's heart swelled with pride. "Thank you, Mr. Rodriguez. This means the world to us." Mr. Rodriguez smiled warmly. "Your son has a bright future ahead. We'll be in touch with the details." The days that followed were a whirlwind of excitement and preparation. The offer from the national team meant they would need to move to the capital, where Daniel would train and attend school. Carmen felt a mixture of joy and anxiety about the changes ahead. "Mom, are you sure about this?" Daniel asked one evening, sensing her unease. Carmen smiled reassuringly. "It's a big change, but it's an incredible opportunity for you. I'm so proud of you, and we'll face this new chapter together." With determination, Carmen began packing their belongings and making arrangements for the move. She also applied for teaching positions in the capital, hoping to find a stable job that would support them both. On their last day in their small town, neighbors and friends gathered to say goodbye. Mrs. Mendoza hugged Carmen tightly. "You've been an inspiration to all of us, Carmen. We'll miss you both." "We'll miss you too," Carmen replied, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank you for everything." The move to the capital was daunting, but filled with promise. The city was vast and bustling, a stark contrast to their quiet town. They settled into a modest apartment near Daniel's new school and training facility. Carmen marveled at the opportunities that lay ahead. Shortly after their arrival, Carmen received good news. She had been offered a teaching position at a local school. The stability of the job eased her worries, and she felt a renewed sense of purpose. One afternoon, as Carmen prepared dinner, Daniel burst into the apartment, his face alight with excitement. "Mom, guess what? I've been offered a sponsorship deal." Carmen turned to him, astonished. "A sponsorship deal? That's incredible, Daniel. Tell me more." Daniel explained, his words tumbling out in a rush. "A sportswear company wants to sponsor me. They'll provide my gear and even pay for some of my expenses. This will help us so much." Carmen hugged him tightly, tears of joy in her eyes. "I'm so proud of you, Daniel. You're achieving your dreams, and it's just the beginning." The sponsorship deal brought additional financial support, easing their transition into city life. Daniel thrived in his new environment, balancing his rigorous training with schoolwork. Carmen found fulfillment in her teaching job, forming connections with her students and colleagues. As weeks turned into months, Carmen and Daniel embraced their new life. They navigated challenges together, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. The capital city, once a daunting unknown, became a place of opportunity and growth. The bustling streets of the capital city were a far cry from the quiet life Carmen and Daniel had left behind. The sounds of car horns and chatter filled the air as Carmen navigated her way home from the market, bags of groceries in hand. She felt a sense of accomplishment, having managed to stretch her budget to cover their needs for the week. As she turned a corner, a sudden force yanked her purse from her shoulder. "Hey!" she shouted, stumbling as the thief bolted down the street. Panic surged through her as she realized all their money and important documents were in that purse. "Stop him!" Carmen's voice was desperate, but the crowded street seemed indifferent to her plight. Just then, a tall man in his 40s, with an athletic build and kind eyes, sprang into action. He chased the thief with surprising speed, catching up to him in no time. With a swift move, he tackled the thief to the ground, retrieving the purse. "Let go of me!" the thief protested, but the man held firm. "Not a chance," he replied sternly, handing the purse back to Carmen as she approached, breathless. "Thank you so much," Carmen said, her voice trembling with relief. "I don't know what I would have done without your help." "You're welcome. My name's Alejandro," he said, offering a warm smile as he helped her gather her scattered groceries. "I'm Carmen," she replied, still shaken but grateful. "I can't thank you enough, Alejandro. You saved me." "It's no trouble at all," Alejandro said, waving off her thanks. "Let me walk you home, just to be safe." They chatted about the city, their lives, and she found herself laughing at his witty remarks and stories. When they reached her apartment, Daniel burst through the door. "Mom, you're home. Who's this?" "This is Alejandro. He helped me when someone tried to steal my purse," Carmen explained. "Wow, thank you, Mr. Alejandro," Daniel said, his eyes wide with admiration. Alejandro chuckled. "It was my pleasure." Over the next few weeks, Alejandro's presence became a comforting fixture in their lives. He often stopped by to check on them, bringing small gifts or simply offering his company. Carmen found herself looking forward to his visits, appreciating the warmth and security he brought. One evening, Alejandro invited them to a local cafe. As they chatted, Daniel's curiosity got the better of him. "Alejandro, you seem to know a lot about football. Did you play?" Alejandro smiled, a twinkle in his eye. "I did, actually. I played professionally before I retired." Daniel's jaw dropped. "No way. Who did you play for?" Alejandro leaned back, enjoying the moment. "I played for the national team and a few international clubs. It was a great experience." Daniel was awestruck. "That's incredible. Can you teach me some tricks?" "Of course," Alejandro said warmly. "I'd be happy to share what I know." Carmen watched the exchange with a mixture of pride and joy. Alejandro had not only helped her in a moment of crisis, but had also become a mentor to Daniel. The bond between them grew stronger with each passing day, filled with laughter, learning, and mutual respect. As the evening drew to a close, Alejandro walked them back home. "Thank you for a wonderful evening," Carmen said, her smile reflecting the happiness she felt. "The pleasure was all mine," Alejandro replied, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer. "You both have brought a lot of joy into my life." Carmen's heart warmed at his words. She felt a connection with Alejandro that went beyond gratitude. It was the beginning of something special, a friendship that had the potential to blossom into something even more meaningful. In the days that followed, Carmen often found herself thinking about Alejandro, the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed, and the kindness that seemed to radiate from him. She realized that, in a city full of strangers, she had found a true friend, and perhaps, just maybe, something more. The crisp autumn air was filled with the sounds of children playing and the distant hum of city life. Carmen stood on the balcony of their apartment, savoring a rare moment of peace. Daniel was at football practice, and she had a few hours to herself. Her thoughts wandered to Alejandro and the growing friendship that had brought so much joy into their lives. Just then, she heard familiar voices from the street below. Peering over the railing, she saw Alejandro walking with a woman she didn't recognize. They were laughing, their conversation punctuated by playful nudges and shared smiles. Carmen's heart sank. Who was this woman, and what did she mean to Alejandro? That evening, as Alejandro arrived for their usual dinner together, Carmen's demeanor was noticeably colder. "Carmen, is everything all right?" Alejandro asked, sensing the tension. "Everything's fine," Carmen replied curtly, avoiding his gaze. She busied herself with setting the table, her mind racing with unanswered questions. Days turned into weeks, and Carmen found herself distancing from Alejandro. She threw herself into her work and Daniel's budding football career, trying to drown out the gnawing suspicion that had taken root in her heart. Every time Alejandro tried to reach out, she found an excuse to avoid him. That evening, determined to find the truth, Carmen walked to Alejandro's apartment. She hesitated at the door, her heart pounding. Summoning her courage, she knocked. Alejandro opened the door, surprise and relief washing over his face. "Carmen, I'm so glad you're here. We need to talk," he said, stepping aside to let her in. Inside, the woman Carmen had seen with Alejandro was sitting on the couch, sipping tea. She looked up and smiled warmly. "You must be Carmen. Alejandro has told me so much about you." Carmen felt a pang of confusion. "And you are?" "I'm Isabella, Alejandro's sister," the woman said, standing up to shake Carmen's hand. Relief and embarrassment flooded Carmen at once. "His sister?" she echoed, her cheeks flushing. I thought..." Alejandro chuckled softly, the tension melting away. "Carmen, I should have introduced you two earlier. Isabella was visiting for a few weeks, and I wanted to spend some time with her. I'm sorry if it caused any misunderstanding." Carmen felt tears of relief prickling her eyes. "I'm the one who should apologize. I jumped to conclusions without talking to you." Alejandro stepped closer, his eyes gentle. "It's all right, Carmen. Let's put this behind us. I value our friendship too much to let a misunderstanding come between us." Carmen nodded, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. "Thank you, Alejandro. And I'm sorry, Isabella, for my behavior." Isabella smiled warmly. "No harm done. I'm just glad we cleared things up." The three of them spent the evening chatting and laughing, the air filled with newfound understanding and camaraderie. As Carmen and Alejandro walked back to her apartment later, she felt a renewed sense of connection with him. "I'm really sorry for everything, Alejandro," she said quietly. "Don't be," he replied, taking her hand. "We all make mistakes. What matters is that we learn from them and move forward." Carmen squeezed his hand, grateful for his understanding and patience. As they reached her door, she turned to him with a smile. "Thank you, Alejandro, for everything." He smiled back. "Anytime, Carmen. Anytime." The stadium was alive with the buzz of excitement as Daniel's team prepared for another crucial match. The stands were filled with cheering fans, parents and friends, all eager to witness the young talents on the field. Carmen sat nervously, her eyes glued to Daniel as he warmed up with his teammates. "Mom, did you see that?" Daniel ran over, his face glowing with enthusiasm. "We're going to win today. I can feel it." "I know you will, sweetheart. Just play your best," Carmen replied, hugging him tightly. She looked around, hoping to spot Alejandro. Despite their recent reconciliation, she hadn't seen him in a while and she missed his reassuring presence. As the match began, Carmen's heart raced with every play. Daniel was a star on the field, his skill and determination evident with every move. Suddenly, a familiar voice beside her made her jump. "He's incredible, isn't he?" Carmen turned to see Alejandro standing there, his eyes filled with admiration. "Alejandro!" she exclaimed, a mixture of relief and happiness washing over her. "Of course, I wouldn't miss this for the world," Alejandro replied, taking a seat next to her. They watched the game in comfortable silence, the tension of the past few weeks dissolving in the shared joy of the moment. As the final whistle blew, signaling Daniel's team's victory, the crowd erupted in cheers. Daniel ran to his mother, lifting his arms in triumph. "We did it, Mom! We won!" "I'm so proud of you, Daniel," Carmen said, her voice thick with emotion. Alejandro stepped forward, clapping Daniel on the back. "Great game, champ. You were amazing out there." "Thanks, Alejandro," Daniel beamed, his face glowing with pride. As the crowd began to disperse, Carmen and Alejandro found a quiet spot by the field. "Alejandro, I'm really glad you came today," Carmen said softly. "I'm glad too, Carmen. We need to talk," Alejandro replied, taking her hands in his. "I want to clear up any remaining doubts you might have. Isabella is just my sister, nothing more." Carmen nodded, her eyes welling with tears. "I know. I was foolish to doubt you. I'm sorry for pushing you away." Alejandro smiled gently. "It's all in the past. What matters is that we're here now, together." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Carmen's heart skipped a beat as he got down on one knee. "Carmen, these past months have shown me how much you mean to me. Your strength, your kindness, and your love for Daniel have touched me deeply. Will you marry me?" Carmen's breath caught in her throat. She looked at Alejandro, her eyes filled with love and certainty. "Yes, Alejandro, I will marry you." Cheers erupted from nearby as Daniel, who had been watching from a distance, ran over and threw his arms around both of them. "We're going to be a family!" Tears of joy streamed down Carmen's face as she hugged Daniel and Alejandro tightly. "Yes, we are. A family." The days that followed were filled with a flurry of activity as they planned their future together. Carmen moved in with Alejandro, and they began blending their lives, filled with love, laughter, and mutual respect. One evening, as they sat on the balcony of their new home, watching the sunset paint the sky with brilliant hues, Carmen felt a deep sense of peace and fulfillment. "This is everything I ever dreamed of, Alejandro," she said, her voice soft with contentment. "And more," Alejandro added, squeezing her hand. "We have a bright future ahead of us, filled with love and endless possibilities." The summer sun cast a warm glow over the familiar streets of Daniel's hometown as he drove through, memories flooding back with each turn. It had been years since he last visited, and today's trip carried a somber purpose. Daniel had heard from an old friend that Mrs. Mendoza, the kind woman who had once gifted him his first football uniform, was in poor health. As he pulled up to her modest house, he felt a pang of sadness. The garden, once vibrant with flowers, now seemed neglected. Daniel knocked gently on the door, and after a moment it opened to reveal Mrs. Mendoza in a wheelchair, looking frail but smiling warmly. "Daniel, it's so good to see you," she greeted him, her voice filled with genuine affection. "Mrs. Mendoza, I've missed you," Daniel replied, kneeling to hug her. "I came as soon as I heard. How are you holding up?" Mrs. Mendoza sighed, her eyes betraying her weariness. "I'm managing, dear. It's been tough since Martine passed, but I get by." Daniel's heart ached at the mention of Martine. He had been a close friend, and his loss was deeply felt. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Mendoza. I wish I had known sooner." They spent the afternoon reminiscing, the old house filled with laughter and shared memories. But as the day wore on, Daniel's concern grew. Mrs. Mendoza's health was clearly deteriorating, and he couldn't ignore it. "Mrs. Mendoza, have you seen a doctor about your condition?" Daniel asked gently. She shook her head. "Doctors are expensive, and I can't afford the surgery they recommend." Daniel took her hand, his determination solidifying. "Let me help. You've done so much for me, and now it's my turn." Mrs. Mendoza looked at him, her eyes welling with tears. "I can't ask you to do that, Daniel. You have your own life and responsibilities." "You're not asking. I'm offering," Daniel insisted. "Please, let me do this for you. It's the least I can do." Despite her initial resistance, Daniel's persistence paid off. He contacted a reputable clinic in the city and made all the necessary arrangements. The next week, he returned to take Mrs. Mendoza to the clinic, his resolve unwavering. As they arrived, Mrs. Mendoza looked around, clearly overwhelmed. "I don't know how to thank you, Daniel." "You don't have to thank me," Daniel replied, smiling. "Just focus on getting better." Using the sponsorship money he had saved, Daniel covered all of the expenses for her surgery. Watching her being wheeled into the operating room, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. This woman had changed his life with a simple act of kindness, and now he had the chance to repay her. The surgery was a success, and after a few days of recovery, Mrs. Mendoza began her rehabilitation. Daniel visited her daily, encouraging her through each step of the process. One afternoon, as they sat in the hospital garden, Mrs. Mendoza looked at Daniel with tear-filled eyes. "You've given me my life back, Daniel. I don't know how to repay you." "You've already repaid me 100 times over," Daniel said softly. "Your kindness gave me the confidence to chase my dreams. This is my way of saying thank you." As the weeks passed, Mrs. Mendoza's health improved significantly. The crisp morning air was filled with the scent of blooming flowers as Carmen and Daniel walked hand in hand through the hospital garden. Beside them, Mrs. Mendoza took confident steps, her face glowing with joy and gratitude. "It's a miracle," Mrs. Mendoza said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I never thought I'd walk again, and now here I am, thanks to you, Daniel." Daniel smiled warmly. "You deserve every bit of happiness, Mrs. Mendoza. You've always been there for me, and I'm glad I could be here for you." As they strolled, Carmen felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The journey they had been on was marked by challenges and triumphs, and seeing Mrs. Mendoza walk again was a testament to the power of love and perseverance. Later that afternoon, they returned home to find Alejandro waiting with a bouquet of roses. "These are for you, Carmen," he said, his eyes twinkling with affection. "And I have something else for both of you." Curious, Carmen and Daniel exchanged glances as Alejandro handed them an envelope. Inside was a beautifully designed wedding invitation. "It's time we make it official," Alejandro said, his voice filled with warmth. The wedding was a small, intimate affair, held in a charming garden surrounded by close friends and family. Daniel stood proudly as the best man, his heart brimming with happiness for his mother. As Carmen and Alejandro exchanged vows, the air was filled with the promise of a bright future. Months passed, and life settled into a joyful routine. Daniel's football career continued to flourish, and his dedication on the field earned him recognition. One evening, as they gathered for dinner, Daniel received a phone call that would change his life. "Mom, Alejandro, you won't believe this," Daniel said, his eyes wide with excitement. "I've been offered a spot on an international team. They want me to play in Europe." Carmen's heart swelled with pride. "Daniel, that's incredible. You've worked so hard for this. I'm so proud of you." Alejandro clapped him on the back, beaming with pride. You deserve it, Daniel. This is just the beginning of a new adventure. The decision to move to Europe was both exhilarating and daunting. As Daniel prepared for his new journey, Carmen and Alejandro stood by his side, offering unwavering support. They helped him pack, arranged travel plans, and made sure he had everything he needed for this next chapter. On the day of his departure, the airport buzzed with activity. Daniel hugged Carmen tightly, feeling a mix of excitement and nostalgia. "I promise to make you proud, Mom." "You already have, Daniel," Carmen replied, her voice filled with emotion. "Go chase your dreams. We'll always be here, cheering you on." Alejandro pulled Daniel into a bear hug. "Remember, we're just a phone call away. Stay focused and enjoy every moment." As Daniel walked towards the departure gate, he turned back to wave, his heart brimming with gratitude for the support and love that had shaped his journey. Carmen and Alejandro watched him go, their hearts full of pride and anticipation for what the future held. Life in Europe was a whirlwind of new experiences for Daniel. He embraced the challenges and opportunities that came with playing at an international level. His talent and determination shone through, earning him accolades and the admiration of fans worldwide. Back home, Carmen and Alejandro settled into a life of shared dreams and quiet contentment. They spent their days nurturing their garden, exploring new hobbies, and cherishing the moments they had together. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, Carmen turned to Alejandro with a smile. "We've come so far, haven't we?" Alejandro nodded, taking her hand in his. "Yes, we have. And the journey is far from over. There's so much more to look forward to." As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Carmen felt a profound sense of peace. Their lives had been enriched by love, kindness, and the unwavering support of those around them. With Daniel's success and their own dreams fulfilled, they were ready to embrace whatever the future held, knowing that together they could overcome anything. In that moment, surrounded by the beauty of their garden and the warmth of their love, Carmen and Alejandro knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter, filled with endless possibilities. And with Daniel blazing trails on the international stage, their hearts swelled with pride and hope for the bright future that lay ahead.